He pulled the tarp off and froze. The car was gone, the driveway empty, and in its place, a message no living soul should have ever received. A letter in her handwriting, dated yesterday. But she died 3 years ago. If you're reading this, I found you first. Now the engine isn't the only thing waking up, and some doors, once opened, don't close without taking something back. But the real twist? He's not the only one looking for that car anymore. Walter, retired mechanic and grieving widower, couldn't know that a glint of turquoise off the trail would reopen a door he'd sealed shut with his wife's passing. Claire, Ellie's niece and reluctant messenger, had no idea that delivering a forgotten letter would unravel a lifetime her aunt had hidden behind casseroles and silence. David, Ellie's son and a man raised in emotional shadows, certainly couldn't realize that the stolen car he reclaimed wasn't just a relic, it was the final road to the father he never knew he was missing. It all started with a rusted shimmer in the sunlight, the kind of flicker that dances at the corner of your vision when you're not looking for anything in particular but somehow end up finding something that feels like it's been waiting for you all along. Walter Briggs had walked the same loop for nearly 3 years since his wife Linda passed, down Sycamore Lane past the bakery that only opened Thursdays now, across Old County Road 17 where the wooden pedestrian sign still bore the faded sticker from the 1992 town fair, and finally past the overgrown trail near the edge of the Jenkins property, where nothing much ever happened anymore except the slow encroachment of wild honeysuckle and time. It was the kind of walk meant more for thinking than exercise, with pauses built in not because of age or breathlessness but because the mind sometimes needs a moment to catch up with the heart. That afternoon, with the sky a dull gold and the air holding the kind of dry heat that made pine needles crisp underfoot, Walter saw something strange just off the path, something metallic, something curved, something out of place among the vines and rusted fence posts. He squinted through the brush, stepping closer with the cautious rhythm of someone who didn't want to disturb the silence unless it was absolutely worth it. The first thing he saw was a sliver of turquoise, no, not paint exactly, but the ghost of it, peeking from beneath a tangle of blackberry bramble, like a secret someone had tried to bury but forgot to finish the job. He tilted his head and stepped even closer, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and that's when he saw it fully, the unmistakable tail fin of a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air. The chrome strip still catching what little light filtered through the low branches, the rear window cracked but intact, the body sagging just slightly on one side like an old dog that still rises to greet you, even if the hips don't quite cooperate anymore. He hadn't seen a 57 in years, not up close, not like this, and certainly not in this kind of condition. At first glance, most folks would have walked right past it, called it a junker, a scrap heap, a relic that didn't deserve resurrection. But Walter wasn't most folks. He had spent 3 decades teaching high school boys how to rebuild carburetors, how to replace brake lines, how to respect the way a machine talks to you when it's in pain. He told more than a few of them that old cars are like people. You can't just yank parts out and slap new ones in and expect everything to run right again. You have to listen. You have to understand what it went through. And now, staring at the half-buried Bel Air, he felt that strange thrum inside his chest, not quite excitement, not quite fear, but the quiet knock of a door he hadn't approached in a long time. He didn't touch the car. Not yet. Instead, he crouched down slowly, knees popping like a breakfast cereal, and looked closer. The passenger side door bore a long scratch, but beneath the years of grime, he could still make out the faintest shimmer of original paint, the same shade of turquoise blue his first car had been painted when he was 17. The same color Eleanor Hartman had insisted was summertime bottled in steel. Eleanor. Ellie. He hadn't said that name aloud in over 40 years. Funny how memory works, hiding the big things behind bills and appointments and oil changes, and then offering up a whole summer in one breath the moment you see a flash of chrome in the weeds. Ellie had been his first everything. His first real kiss, his first heartbreak, his first glimpse at the kind of joy that could make a 17-year-old believe in forever without a single doubt. They dated during the spring of '63, when the Beatles were just starting to creep onto American radios and her father still threatened to shoot him if he came home 5 minutes late. She used to ride shotgun with her knees tucked up, always barefoot, always singing along to the radio, and always carrying that wide-open smile that made him believe the whole world was made just for them. And the car, the Bel Air, it had been part of all of it. Not his, mind you. It belonged to her brother, who'd gone to Vietnam that summer and never come back. But before he left, he let Ellie borrow it now and then, and on Saturday nights they'd cruise out to Glenmore Lake with milkshakes in hand, her blonde hair catching the breeze like a banner in the wind, her voice lifting into the summer air like a song too sweet to end. One night, parked on the bluff that overlooked the county line, she told him she wanted to leave. Not just town, but the whole pattern: get out, go west, do something nobody expected. He'd smiled, held her hand, and told her he'd go anywhere she wanted. And then senior year ended, and the job at the lumberyard started. And life, in its quiet, relentless way, unfolded in 1,000 tiny turns that eventually closed the door without slamming it. Ellie left town the next spring. He heard she went to San Diego. He wrote one letter. Never mailed it. The card disappeared soon after. And now, here it was. Or at least, something that looked just like it. Could it be the same one? He tried to do the math. Possible? Sure. Likely? Probably not. But something in his gut said yes. Not because of proof, but because of something deeper. Because standing there, in the heat and the dust and the silence, he could feel that this was more than coincidence. He stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees, his fingers trembling just slightly, not from age, but from the electric tension that sometimes buzzes through a person when the past taps them on the shoulder. He took a step back, then another. His mouth was dry, his pulse too fast. This was just a car. A shell. Scrap metal. But it didn't feel like just a car. It felt like a question. And he hadn't asked a real question in a long, long time. That night, after heating up a bowl of leftover stew and watching the first few innings of a game he didn't really care about, Walter sat down at his kitchen table and pulled out an old notebook. He flipped past pages of plumbing diagrams, handwritten oil change logs, and lists of paint codes, until he reached a blank sheet. And he wrote one sentence. If it's really her car, I have to know. He stared at those words for a long time. Then he underlined them. Twice. And the next morning, he walked the loop again. But this time, he brought gloves. By the time Walter returned the next morning, the sky had taken on that soft, linen gray quality that suggested rain might come but probably wouldn't, and the wind was still, like even the birds were holding their breath. He carried with him a pair of thick gardening gloves, an old flashlight from the garage, and a cautious sense of purpose that sat somewhere between dread and anticipation. The path to the car looked slightly more worn, as if his first visit had somehow summoned the memory of others, like footsteps that had faded long ago were now pushing their way back to the surface. The Bel Air was still there, of course, resting under its veil of neglect and time, but now, in the early light, it looked almost defiant, like a sleeping dog who, though aged and scarred, might still remember how to bite. He stepped through the brush carefully, using a branch to push aside a curtain of thorny vines that had wrapped themselves around the driver's side door like possessive fingers. Bits of rusted metal flaked off as he moved closer, and something about the stillness of the scene, the long grass, the silence, the faint smell of iron and wild mint, reminded him of the day his father passed. He reached out slowly, heart pounding not from exertion but from the sheer weight of the moment, and pressed his gloved hand to the door handle. It stuck for a second, then groaned open with a sound so raw and honest it almost hurt his ears. And there it was. The inside of the car, like a room sealed for decades, greeted him with a musty wave of age. Leather, dust, a hint of mildew, and something else beneath it all, something unmistakable. Coconut. That faint sweetness that had lived in her hair, in her suntan lotion, in the air of that unforgettable summer. The scent hit him like a song he hadn't heard in half a century, and for a moment he had to steady himself, one hand on the open door, the other pressed against his chest as if trying to stop time from breaking loose inside him. He leaned in, cautiously, like he was stepping into a memory that wasn't sure whether it wanted to be relived. The dashboard was cracked, but the shape was all there, sweeping lines, chrome knobs, a radio with buttons he instinctively knew how to work even after all these years. The seats were torn in places, the stuffing exposed like brittle cotton, but the pattern of the stitching, he remembered it. Not in detail, but in the same way you remember the feel of a favorite shirt or the way someone's voice sounded when they were reading a letter aloud by the window. Walter sat down slowly in the driver's seat. It gave a soft crunch beneath his weight, but it held. His hands, still gloved, hovered over the steering wheel, then rested there. It felt familiar, not exactly like it had belonged to him, but like it had once belonged to someone who had belonged to him. He glanced at the rearview mirror, cracked diagonally like a scar, and in that warped reflection he almost saw them again, two kids laughing at nothing, their whole lives unspoken in the silence between songs on the radio. He opened the glove box. It stuck, then clicked loose. A moth fluttered out. Inside, there was the usual, an old pack of chewing gum hardened to stone, a torn road map of California, a corroded flashlight missing its batteries, and then, At the very back, tucked deep into the crevice, a thin object wrapped in wax paper. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled it free. It was a photograph, faded almost to sepia, but still clear enough. A boy and a girl, standing beside the car, this car parked beside a lake. Her head was tilted back in laughter, her hand on his shoulder, his arms crossed in that cocky way young men always think makes them look older. It was them. It was Ellie. And him. He didn't remember the picture being taken. Maybe her brother had snapped it before leaving for basic training. Maybe they'd set the camera on the hood and used a timer. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it existed, that it had survived, that it had waited. Walter stared at it for a long time. The edges were soft, worn from the years, and the corners curled like leaves left out in the rain. But it was real. And with it came the truth he had only dared to whisper in the quietest hours since Linda passed. He had loved Ellie in a way that never entirely went away. Even after she left, even after he married, even after life became something practical and steady and filled with bills and birthdays and car repairs, there had always been a part of him, small and quiet and respectful, that had kept her laughter in a box marked sacred. He placed the photo gently on the seat beside him and exhaled slowly, like something inside had been holding its breath for decades and was only now daring to let go. He reached for the keys, not that he expected them to be there, but habit is a hard thing to kill. And that's when he noticed something else. On the passenger side floor, half buried in dirt and pine needles and a shattered plastic air freshener shaped like a palm tree, was a tiny object that caught the light just enough to demand attention. He leaned over, brushing aside the debris, and picked it up. A small silver locket. No chain, just the locket. He pried it open, careful not to break the fragile hinge. Inside, on one side, was a miniature portrait, so tiny it could have fit on a dime, of Ellie. Her high school photo. The one that used to hang in the hallway outside the principal's office, because she'd been homecoming queen the same year Kennedy was shot. And on the other side, a clipping. A tiny square of newspaper, faded almost beyond reading, but he could still make out a few words. Briggs, vocational instructor. Glenmore Lake. His name. His life. Pressed into something so delicate it felt like memory given form. The weight of it all settled and then, not like a blow, but like a quilt pulled gently across his chest by hands he hadn't felt in decades. She had remembered. She had kept pieces of him. Pieces of them. This wasn't just a car. This was a time capsule. A message. A preservation of something that, despite everything, had mattered. He sat there in the silence of the forest, the photo in one hand, the locket in the other, the wind still holding its breath around him. He didn't cry. But something inside him did. Something old. Something grateful. And when he finally stepped out of the car and stood once more beneath the canopy of trees and cloud-filtered light, he looked at the Bel Air not as a curiosity or even as a project. He looked at it as a promise. One he hadn't known he'd made, but one he now felt called to keep. He would bring it back. Not just to running order. Not just to show quality. But to her. To them. To the memory of a girl in the passenger seat, barefoot and laughing, on a road that still existed if he only had the courage to drive it again. Walter didn't return to the car the next day, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew the moment he did, everything would begin to change. He needed time, not just to think, but to allow the weight of what he'd seen and felt to settle into something solid, something he could carry without breaking under it. Instead, he sat on the back porch, sipping lukewarm coffee from his favorite mug, the one with the chipped rim and the faded fishing boat that hadn't looked seaworthy in a decade, and watched the birds flutter in the trees like they knew something he didn't. He kept the photo in his shirt pocket all day, tucked close to his chest like a talisman, like a secret that warmed instead of burned. By evening, he knew. Not with logic. Not with facts. But with that deep certainty that only comes when memory and instinct agree on something before the mind can catch up. The next morning, after a stop at the hardware store for fresh rope, WD-40, a crowbar, and a heavy-duty tarp, Walter made his way back to the overgrown edge of the Jenkins property with purpose in his step and a sense of quiet resolve in his heart. But this time, before heading straight to the car, he walked up the gravel drive that led to the sagging house where Martin Jenkins had lived since the late 70s. Martin had once been a high school linebacker, though these days his frame had softened into something more earthbound, and his movements suggested a man more familiar with recliners than gridirons. Walter knocked on the weathered screen door, and after a moment, Martin appeared, chewing on a toothpick and squinting like the sun itself had offended him. "Well, I'll be," he said, pushing the door open with a slow creak. Didn't expect a visit from Walter Briggs this side of the century. Walter offered a tight smile. Was hoping to ask you something about the car behind your barn. Martin blinked, then tilted his head. What car? Walter gestured toward the brush. The one that's almost swallowed up. Looks like a 57 Bel Air. Martin scratched the back of his neck. Huh. Thought that old heap got towed years ago. Been sitting back there since my cousin left it. Let me think, had to be. Lord, maybe 89. Your cousin? Yeah, Terry Hartman. Married my second cousin. Had a thing for old cars and terrible luck. Bought that one at a storage auction, if memory serves. Never got it running. Left it here and never came back for it. Walter's breath caught. Hartman. Ellie Hartman? He asked, too quickly, his voice tight. Martin narrowed his eyes. Yeah, that was her name. Pretty girl. Used to come around sometimes, back before Terry disappeared. Haven't heard from her in years, though. She was his sister-in-law or something. Walter nodded slowly, the world narrowing into a tunnel of coincidence that no longer felt like chance. You mind if I take a closer look? Martin waved a dismissive hand. Hell, take the damn thing if you want it. Ain't worth more than the metal it's wrought in on. I'd haul it out myself if I still had a truck that ran. Walter smiled politely, though inside something stirred. Relief, yes, but also reverence. Because now it was his. Not just in memory, not just in longing, but in fact. He thanked Martin, shook his hand, and returned to the car with a new sense of ownership, not the kind defined by titles and keys, but by history, emotion, and the strange kind of destiny that wraps around two people like a soft-spoken promise. He cleared the brush slowly, respectfully, as if he were peeling back time instead of thorns, and laid the tarp gently across the roof to protect it from the weather that, until now, hadn't cared what this relic had once meant. The vines came loose reluctantly, as if they too were unwilling to let go, and by midday the car sat more visible than it had in decades, still wounded, still weary, but visible. Walter stepped back, breathing heavily, sweat dampening the collar of his flannel shirt. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. Not with words, not even with a name. Just a whisper of thanks, a breath of hope, a silent acknowledgement that some things are too big for language but too important to leave unspoken. That evening, he backed his trailer down the makeshift path, boards creaking beneath the weight of time and gravel, and carefully winched the car onto it. It wasn't easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. The tires were nearly flat. The undercarriage groaned with every tug, and twice he had to stop to catch his breath and remind himself that this wasn't about speed, it was about meaning. When the Bel Air finally rested on the trailer, strapped down with care and covered with the tarp, Walter looked at it not as a broken thing but as something sleeping, waiting to be woken. Neighbors watched him from porches and driveways as he drove home, some waving, some whispering, and one or two simply nodding like they understood something more than what was visible. He parked the trailer in front of his garage, stepped out of the truck, and stood there in the dusk, staring at the shape beneath the canvas like it was a monument instead of a machine. Later, with a sandwich in one hand and a pad of notes in the other, he sat at the kitchen table and began a list, not just of parts, but of memories. Find original radio model. Reupholster seats, same stitching pattern. Check glove box again. Order coconut-scented air freshener, just one. He didn't need blueprints. He had something better. He had lived it. And he would live it again, not to chase ghosts, not to rewrite the past, but to honor it, to complete something that had remained open for far too long. Tomorrow, the work would begin, and he would not rush it. Because this was not just restoration. It was redemption. The next morning arrived without ceremony, no dramatic sunrise, no birdsong bursting into chorus, just the quiet consistency of life moving forward, one slow breath at a time. Walter stepped out into the early light, a mug of coffee in one hand, and gazed at the shape beneath the tarp as if waiting for it to breathe on its own. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, and the trailer creaked softly beneath the weight of the car, reminding him that nothing about this would be quick or easy. That was fine. He didn't want quick. He wanted honest. He wanted to do this right. By mid-morning, the tarp had been folded and set aside, revealing the Bel Air in all its wounded glory. In the daylight, the dents and scratches seemed more pronounced, the rust more aggressive, but Walter didn't flinch. He stood in silence, letting his eyes trace every line, every curve, every scar as though reading a biography written in metal and age. The first step was cleaning. Not just a rinse with a hose, but a careful, deliberate process of revealing what was still alive beneath the decay. He filled a bucket with warm soapy water, wrapped an old T-shirt around his hand, and began with the hood, slowly wiping away the grime of forgotten years. As the turquoise paint began to emerge in patches, so did his memories. Ellie, her bare feet on the dashboard, laughing at something he'd said, reaching across the seat to change the radio station when his choices got too slow or too sad. He smiled to himself, the corners of his mouth twitching in that quiet way that belongs more to remembering than to amusement. The chrome trim resisted at first, dull and indifferent, but gradually responded to his persistence, as if reluctant to reveal the shine it once held. Walter worked in silence, the kind that's filled with thought, not absence. The soft scrape of cloth against metal, the occasional creak of his knees, the gentle rhythm of his breath, all became part of a ritual that felt sacred in its simplicity. He paused often, not because he tired quickly, but because each task deserved its own moment. He wasn't restoring a car. He was preserving a part of time that had once meant everything, and if he hurried, he might miss something important, something that didn't appear on a parts list or in a manual. Inside the garage, he cleared space for the next stage. Tools were laid out with care, as they had been in his classroom decades earlier, wrenches sorted by size, rags folded neatly, cans of oil arranged like soldiers on a shelf. He began to remove panels, slowly, methodically, with a reverence usually reserved for archaeology. The screws were stubborn, the bolts rusted, but he coaxed them free with patience and the kind of touch that comes only from years of knowing when force is failure. Each piece he removed told a story. The driver's side door had a cigarette burn near the armrest, maybe from her brother, maybe from someone who'd sat there before the car had disappeared into silence. The rear bench seat bore faint impressions of forgotten objects, maybe a purse, a backpack, a curled-up jacket tossed aside in laughter. Beneath the seats he found coins, dimes and nickels from another time, their edges softened by years of immobility. And then, tucked deep inside the lining of the passenger door, he found a yellowed concert stub. July 3, 1963. Roy Orbison. He remembered that night, how they'd driven 3 towns over in the rain, how Ellie had sung along to Only the Lonely, while clutching his hand, her voice trembling not from the cold but from something she couldn't name. He held the ticket for a long time, the edges fragile, the ink fading like a dream you try to hold onto after waking. He placed it gently in a shoebox that now sat beside the photograph, in the locket, a growing shrine to a summer that refused to die. The work became routine in its rhythm, rising early, coffee, 3 or 4 solid hours in the garage, then lunch and a nap, followed by another session before supper. Days passed this way, soft and steady, like a hymn sung slowly enough to feel every word. Friends began to ask questions, neighbors, the mailman, even the cashier at the hardware store. You working on something special? Think it'll run again? Isn't that the kind of job for younger guys? He would nod, smile, and say she deserves one more drive. Because that's what this was. Not just repair, not just restoration, but resurrection. One afternoon, while sanding down the frame beneath the rear window, Walter caught a scent so familiar it stopped him in his tracks, a soft breeze, maybe carried from the past or just stirred up by the shifting dust. And it brought with it an overwhelming sense of being watched, not by eyes, but by memory. He closed his eyes and saw her again, clear as the first time, Ellie in that white sundress with blue polka dots, spinning in circles beside the lake, her laughter echoing like wind chimes in July. He opened his eyes slowly. The garage was quiet. But he wasn't alone. She was here. Not in flesh, but in essence. In the metal. In the silence. In the way the car had found its way back to him across decades and detours and unlikely circumstances. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, oil on his fingers, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, paging through an old Haynes manual he'd pulled from a box in the attic. Half the diagrams were burned into his memory already, but there was comfort in seeing them again, like finding an old friend sitting in the same booth at the diner, sipping the same black coffee and waiting to be remembered. He made a list for the next day. Remove radiator. Order gaskets. Replace distributor cap. Sand and prime trunk interior. Each item on the list was both progress and meditation, a way of building a bridge from the past to the present, one bolt at a time. And so the days passed, slowly, richly, like turning the pages of a beloved book you thought you'd lost. Some evenings, he played music while he worked. Roy Orbison, Connie Francis, The Drifters. And on those nights, the garage felt less like a workspace and more like a cathedral, every note a kind of prayer, every task a benediction. There were moments when doubt crept in, when a part refused to fit, when a screw stripped beyond repair, when his back ached in a way that reminded him of his years and his limitations. But then he would glance at the photo, or open the locket, or run his fingers along the curve of the dashboard, and the doubt would pass, not with triumph, but with grace. Because this was never about finishing. It was about honoring. And in that, there was no failure. Only forward. Only faith. The days had fallen into a rhythm by now: coffee at sunrise, work until the shadows shifted, and silence in between, broken only by the scrape of tools or the whisper of music floating softly through the garage. Walter found comfort in the routine, in the way muscle memory still lived in his hands, even if the joints protested more than they used to. That morning started like the others, unhurried and gray, the sky a soft curtain of clouds that neither promised nor denied rain. He had planned to finish sanding the trunk interior and begin fitting the replacement radiator mounts, but instead, he found himself drawn to the interior again, specifically the space beneath the rear bench seat, which he hadn't yet removed completely. He loosened the bolts carefully, rocking the seat back and forth, the old fabric groaning under strain. With a grunt and one final pull, it came free, revealing a shallow compartment coated in decades of dust and silence. Beneath it, nestled among brittle candy wrappers, a single bobby pin, and what might once have been a tube of lipstick, was a small cloth pouch, blue velvet, tied at the top with a thin white ribbon now yellowed with time. Walter stared at it for several long seconds before reaching in, his fingers trembling, not from effort, but from something deeper. Reverence. Anticipation. The quiet ache of something sacred. He untied the ribbon slowly. Inside the pouch was a cassette tape. Maxell. 90 minutes. Hand-labeled in loopy, unmistakably feminine handwriting that stopped his breath cold. Summer 63, Ellie. He sat there, frozen, the pouch still resting in his lap, the cassette resting in his palm like it was made of glass. For a moment, he wasn't in the garage anymore. He was 17 again. He was back at Glenmore Lake. He was in the passenger seat of her brother's Bel Air, the windows down, the sun low on the horizon, and Ellie's voice singing softly over a background of static and laughter. He stood up, walked inside the house, and went straight to the hall closet where Linda's old tape deck still sat on the top shelf, covered in a flannel scarf. She had kept it for years, just in case, though neither of them had used it since the early 2000s. Walter wiped the dust from its surface, inserted the tape, and gently pressed play. There was a moment of hiss, the unmistakable hum of old magnetic tape turning slowly, and then her voice, young and bright, filled the room. "Hi," she said, laughing softly. "I don't know why I'm doing this, but maybe someday I'll be glad I did." There was a pause. "I guess, if you're hearing this, I didn't throw it away like I thought I might. So that's something." Walter sat down in the old armchair near the window and closed his eyes. Her voice continued. "I'm recording this after our drive. You know the one. The long one. I've never felt more myself than I did in that car, with you, windows down, radio up, my bare feet on the dash like a delinquent. I know we're young. And I know life's about to take us both in different directions. A breath. But I also know this. Some people leave a mark, not like a scratch or a scar, but like a carving in softwood, something you can trace with your fingers long after the tree has grown tall." Walter's hands were pressed together now, elbows on his knees, tears welling at the edges of his eyes. "You'll probably never hear this," Ellie's voice said. "Maybe I'll erase it. Maybe I'll throw it in the lake. But just in case, I want you to know that I loved you. Not like a teenage crush, not like those songs on the radio. I mean the kind of love that stays, even when the roads change." The tape clicked softly, paused, then continued, music now, slow and familiar. Roy Orbison again, maybe. Or Patsy Cline. Walter didn't move. He couldn't. The house was silent, but something in him was shouting, echoing, reverberating through decades of quiet compromise and aging routines. She had felt it too. She had remembered. She had left a piece of herself inside that car, not by accident, not as a forgotten relic, but as a message meant to be found. When the tape ended, he didn't rewind it. He just sat there, letting the silence surround him again. Only this time it wasn't empty. It was full with her voice, her memory, her laughter, and the certainty that none of it had been one-sided. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he went back out to the garage, turned on the soft yellow light above the workbench, and began to polish the rearview mirror. Slowly, carefully, because soon the car would run again. And when it did, he would see her not behind him, but beside him, in every curve of the dashboard, in every flash of chrome, in the soft creak of the seat when he sat down and turned the key. But the full truth, Why the car had returned to him, why it had waited so long, what it meant beyond memory, that was still ahead, just out of reach, but getting closer. The morning arrived with the kind of stillness that felt deliberate, as if even nature knew something important was about to happen. Walter stepped out of the house and into the light mist that hung low over the street, curling around mailboxes and telephone poles like memory made visible. His breath hung in the air, slow and measured, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at the garage like it was a cathedral and today was some kind of high holiday. Inside, the Bel Air waited cleaner now, sharper in its lines, its turquoise paint no longer hiding behind grime but not yet restored to its former glory either. It was somewhere in between, like Walter himself, not the man he used to be, not yet the man he would become once this journey was done. Today was the day he would try to start the engine. He had replaced the plugs, cleaned out the fuel lines, rebuilt the carburetor with hands that still remembered the way each gasket fit like a verse in a song, and installed a new battery, the terminals shining like silver coins. He had triple-checked the wiring, taken his time with every bolt, and run each system through in his mind so many times that he could see the firing order in his sleep. But still, there was no guarantee. Not with something this old, this weathered, this storied. Walter stood beside the open hood, a wrench in one hand, a rag in the other. The radio was silent. No music today. No distractions. Just the car, the tools, and the quiet. He slid into the driver's seat, the cushion groaning beneath his weight, and stared at the dashboard like it might offer him a sign. His fingers found the ignition smooth, familiar, as if no time had passed at all. He turned the key. Nothing. Just the soft click of a starter trying to remember what it used to be. He exhaled slowly, not defeated, just reminded that life, like machines, rarely wakes up on the first try. He tried again. Click. A cough. Then silence. He reached down, adjusted the choke, tapped the gas twice, and tried once more. This time, the engine turned. A low, grinding whir that rose into a ragged sputter, coughing smoke from the tailpipe like a dragon clearing its throat after a long sleep. Walter held his breath. The sputter continued. Then smoothed. Then held. The engine ran. Not cleanly. Not proudly. But alive. The vibrations ran up through the seat, into his spine, through his chest, and finally into his heart, which had begun to beat just a little faster now. He let it idle, eyes closed, hands resting on the steering wheel like it was the shoulder of someone he'd thought he'd never see again. The smell of fuel and old leather filled the garage. It wasn't pleasant, but it was honest. He shut the engine off after a minute, not wanting to push his luck. But that was all he needed. The car had spoken, and it had said, "I remember." He sat in silence for a while afterward, not moving, just letting the moment settle around him like a favorite coat. But the moment was interrupted by the sharp knock at the front door. He wasn't expecting anyone. The mail came later. The neighbors rarely stopped by without calling. He opened the door to find a woman standing on the porch. She was in her early 60s, maybe, with silver-streaked hair pulled back beneath a wide-brimmed hat, jeans that bore the dust of long travel, and a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder. Her face was sun-kissed, sharp in its lines but softened by something that felt like patience, or maybe regret. She removed her sunglasses slowly. "I'm looking for Walter Briggs," she said. Her voice was familiar. Not from memory, but from something deeper, like hearing a song you've never heard before and somehow knowing the next note. "I'm Walter," he said, cautiously. "Can I help you?" She hesitated. "My name's Claire Hartman." The name hit him like a jolt to the ribs. "Ellie's niece," she added quickly. I'm sorry to show up like this. I wasn't sure you'd even be here." He stepped aside instinctively. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd listened to Ellie's voice on the tape just days earlier. The cassette player still sat on the counter like a quiet witness. Claire removed the satchel and placed it on the table gently, as if it carried something fragile. "I didn't know she'd kept anything," Walter said finally, after a long silence. "She kept everything," Claire replied. "She talked about you more than you'd believe." He blinked. "She never reached out," he said quietly. "She wanted to," Claire said, and the way her voice cracked just slightly told him she wasn't lying. "She kept your letters. Even the ones you never sent. I found them after she passed." Walter looked up, startled. "She passed?" Claire nodded. 3 years ago. Cancer. She didn't want to fight it. Said she'd lived the parts that mattered. Walter looked away, the light in the window suddenly too bright. "She talked about that summer like it was yesterday," Claire continued. "Said it was the most honest thing she'd ever known." Walter swallowed hard. "In the car?" he asked. Claire opened the satchel and pulled out a folder. Inside were photographs, recent ones, of the Bel Air, buried beneath bramble, surrounded by trees, forgotten by most. She told me where it was. Said someone might come looking for it one day. Said if they did, it would be you. Walter felt the air thicken. She left this too, Claire added, reaching deeper into the bag. Told me not to open it unless you found the car. She handed him a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed, the handwriting unmistakable. Ellie's. To Walter. For when the engine starts again. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he placed it on the table like a sacred thing. Claire stood. I should go. I didn't mean to intrude. You didn't. They stood in silence for a long moment before she turned and walked down the steps. As she reached the end of the driveway, she looked back. She waited for you, you know, Claire said softly. In her own way. Walter nodded. I think I waited for her too, he whispered. When she was gone, he sat back down and picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just held it. Because sometimes, the thing you've waited a lifetime for deserves more than just a quick glance. It deserves a moment. And maybe, if you're lucky, a second chance. Walter waited until the house was quiet, truly quiet. Not just the absence of noise, but the kind of stillness that comes only when both the day and the mind have settled into a shared pause. The envelope sat untouched on the kitchen table, the lamplight casting a soft shadow across its surface, as if even the light itself knew better than to be too bold. He had made himself a cup of tea, out of habit more than desire, and left it to grow cold beside him. His hand hovered over the letter more than once, only to pull back, the weight of what it might say heavier than any fear he could name. But at last, he opened it. The paper inside was old, folded with care, the ink slightly faded but still clear, each word written in the precise, looping cursive he remembered from notes passed between lockers, from summer postcards, from the corner of birthday cards signed Love Always. Ellie. He unfolded it slowly. Walter. If you're reading this, it means the car started. Or at least, you tried. And if you tried, it means you still remember. And if you still remember, well, that means more to me than you'll ever know. I've started this letter more times than I can count. In my head, on napkins, in notebooks, and finally, here, on real paper, the kind that smells a little like something worth keeping. That's what I always hoped this would be. Something worth keeping. Walter paused, his thumb tracing the edge of the paper. The scent of the ink, faintly metallic and old, mingled with the silence like a forgotten perfume. There's so much I could say. So many years between us. But there's one thing I need you to know before anything else. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I was afraid that if I stayed, I would never become anything outside of us. And the truth is, I didn't. Not really. Not where it counted. Walter felt the breath leave his chest slowly, like air escaping a tire that had held too much for too long. I married. I raised a family. I made casseroles and packed lunches and drove to choir practice. But I never once sat in a car and felt the wind in my hair without hearing your voice beside me. I never looked at another man's hands on a steering wheel without remembering how yours used to drum to the rhythm of songs I didn't even like. You were the best part of me. And the part one was too young, and maybe too proud, to hold on to. The car, our car, I didn't mean for it to end up in the woods. My brother had it. He was supposed to restore it, then sell it. But time got away from him, and from all of us. I never told my husband where it came from. I never told my daughter what it meant. But when I got sick, and I knew the end was coming, I gave Claire the instructions. If you came looking for it, if you found it, she was to give you this. Walter stared at the page, the words swimming slightly before coming back into focus. I don't know what kind of life you've lived since we parted, Walter. I imagine it was steady, kind, and full of quiet strength, because that's what you were to me. Steady, kind, strong in the places people didn't notice until it mattered. I don't regret my life. But I regret not saying goodbye. Properly. I regret not telling you that the necklace you gave me that summer, the tiny locket with our initials carved in the back, I wore it under my dress on my wedding day. And almost every day after. Until I lost it. Or thought I did. Walter's heart skipped. The locket. The one he had found in the car. If it's still in the car, then it's meant to be yours now. I've held on to you long enough. Maybe it's time you held on to me for a little while. There's one more thing. If the car runs again, if you bring it back to life, I want you to drive it. Not just around the block. I want you to take it somewhere that matters. Somewhere we never got to go. Somewhere that makes your hands tremble a little on the wheel. I want you to feel young again, not because you were, but because you remember how it felt. And maybe, just maybe, When you're out there on the road, with the windows down and the sun low in the sky, you'll look to your right and see me, barefoot and laughing, reaching across the seat to change the radio station one last time. I'll be there. I promise. Love always. Ellie. Walter folded the letter slowly, pressing his fingers to the crease like a blessing. For a long time he didn't move. The house was utterly silent, the ticking of the kitchen clock the only sound, steady, measured, like the beating of a heart that had just been reminded it could still feel. He stood at last and walked to the garage. The Bel Air sat quietly beneath the glow of the overhead bulb, its body still rough in places, its heart still waking. He placed the letter gently in the glove box, next to the photograph, the concert ticket, and the locket. Then he placed his palm flat on the hood. "I'll take you," he whispered. "Wherever it is we were meant to go." The next day, he began to plan the trip. But first, the car needed to be ready, not just to run, but to shine. Because this wasn't just a drive. It was a homecoming. Walter never rushed the final steps. That was the promise he made to himself from the beginning, that this would not be a race, not a checklist of mechanical victories, but a conversation between memory and time. So, when the final coat of clear lacquer dried along the hood and the chrome had been polished until it reflected the golden slant of the evening sun, he stood back and didn't speak. He simply looked. The Bel Air stood proud now, not showroom perfect, not sterile, but restored in the way that only love and patience could manage. The turquoise body gleamed, but not coldly. It glowed. The white wall tires, new but era-faithful, held the weight of the car like they understood what it had carried. The interior smelled like new leather stitched over old stories, with the original steering wheel still in place, its surface worn in the exact shape of a 17-year-old boy's dreams. He spent the evening mapping his route, not with GPS or trip planning apps, but with an old paper road atlas he pulled from the back of a closet. The corners were curled, the cover creased, and inside, he marked the path with a pencil, slowly drawing a line from Willow Falls down to the coastal town of Monterey Bay. It was a drive he and Ellie had once dreamed about. From cornfields to cliffside. From sweet tea to sea salt. Walter circled a spot near the midpoint, Crescent Hill, where they'd once talked of camping, of finding a spot under the stars and naming constellations wrong on purpose. He planned to stop there, maybe even stay a night. The trip would take 3 days. Maybe 4. Plenty of time. Plenty of silence, too. He packed light, just one suitcase, a thermos, Ellie's letter, the locket, the cassette tape, and a blanket that still smelled faintly of lavender and liniment. On the morning of his planned departure, he woke early, too early for a man his age, and moved through the house like someone preparing for something sacred. He made coffee but didn't drink it. He checked his watch but didn't believe it. He shaved, even though no one would see him for hours. And then, stepping out into the morning light with his heart full of something like peace, he turned the corner of the house. And the car was gone. He stopped mid-step, not out of disbelief, but because his body simply didn't know what else to do. The trailer was still there, the tire tracks unbroken. But the Bel Air, the car he had coaxed back to life with his hands and memories and half-healed regrets, was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the kind of shock that comes with panic. It was the kind that comes when something sacred has been defiled. He walked the perimeter of the yard. No sign of forced entry. No broken glass. No oil stains. No skid marks. He knocked on 3 doors, Mrs. Halston across the street, who always watched the neighborhood through her front window, the Millers next door, who had teenage grandkids visiting, and finally, Greg the postman, who had just begun his route. None had seen or heard anything. Walter returned to the empty driveway and sat on the porch steps. And for the first time since this journey began, he felt lost, not in the world, but in himself. He had followed every thread of memory, honored every detail, polished and sanded and prayed until the machine breathed again, only to have it vanish like a mirage at the edge of a desert he thought he'd crossed. Then his phone buzzed. A message. No name. Just a number. One he didn't recognize. It read, "I think this belongs to me." Below it, a photo. The Bel Air. Parked under a carport. The angle blurry, like it had been taken in haste. Walter's breath caught. He stared at the message, his hands trembling, then tapped a reply. "Who are you?" A few seconds later, another message arrived. "My name's David. Ellie was my mother." He sat there, phone in hand, mind racing not with anger, not yet, but with questions. He hadn't known Ellie had a son. She'd never mentioned one in the letter. Claire hadn't said anything either. Then another message followed. "She left it to me. I just found out you had it. I'm at 126 Boyd Creek Road. Come if you want to talk. Walter stood slowly. Boyd Creek Road was less than 15 minutes away. He grabbed his coat, keys, and the folder of papers related to the car, title history, parts list, even the cassette. He left the suitcase behind. This wasn't that kind of trip. He didn't call the police. He didn't shout. He just drove. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time he pulled into the gravel lot outside a low, rust-colored house nestled behind a row of sycamores. The Bel Air sat in the carport exactly as it had appeared in the photo, unharmed, unaltered. David was waiting on the steps. Tall, mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a denim jacket and jeans that had seen long days. His expression was unreadable, equal parts wary and regretful. Walter stepped out of the truck and met his gaze. You could have just knocked, he said softly. David shrugged. Didn't know if you'd give it up. It's not mine, Walter replied. Not really. Not entirely. There was a long pause. She told me about you, David said. Not much. Just enough. She never told me about you, Walter answered. David's face tightened, just slightly. That tracks. They stood in silence for a long time, the car between them. Walter walked closer, laid his hand on the hood. I didn't take it to keep it. I brought it back to honor it. I know, David said. That's why I let you finish it. Walter blinked. What? David reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a set of keys. I've known it was in your yard for a while. Claire told me. I just waited. Why now? David looked at the car, not at Walter. Because I had to know what it meant to her. And to you. And maybe to me. He held out the keys. Walter hesitated. Why give it back? David gave a small, bitter smile. Because my mother didn't want a museum piece. She wanted someone to drive it. Walter took the keys. David turned and walked inside. Walter stood there for a while, his hand on the door handle. He didn't know what part 9 would bring yet. But the car was his again. And this time, he wouldn't delay. Walter woke before the alarm. Not because he was anxious, and not because of age, but because something inside him had already begun moving as if the journey had started in his sleep, and now his body was merely catching up. He dressed slowly, savoring the feel of cotton against skin, leather shoes brushing against the floor, the crisp collar of his favorite shirt, the one Ellie once teased him about because it made him look too serious for a boy with eyes that soft. He folded her letter and slipped it into his breast pocket. The morning was cool and pale, the first stretch of sky already losing its stars to the coming sun. Walter packed the suitcase again, lighter now, and added the thermos, a handful of cassette tapes he dug out of an old drawer, the Haynes manual, because some habits never die, and one last thing, the locket. He placed it gently in the glove compartment beside Ellie's note and paused a moment, his fingers lingering on the handle before closing it shut. The Bel Air started on the first turn of the key. The engine purred, not perfectly, but with the kind of aged confidence that comes from being brought back to life by someone who remembered its heart. Walter pulled out of the driveway, waved once to the mailbox, and turned east toward the open road. He didn't play music right away. He let the wind speak first, rolling in through the half-open windows, brushing against the creases in his face, curling around his fingers on the wheel like a familiar companion. The road unfolded in long, gentle curves, winding past barns and fields and shuttered roadside motels with faded Coca-Cola signs. The yellow lines were steady, the engine steady, the man behind the wheel steady. It felt like breathing. Hours passed, but they passed differently now, not as time to be spent, but as space to be remembered. He stopped once for gas, once for coffee, and once just to sit by a fence post and watch a hawk glide silently above a patch of golden grass. Midway through the second day, just before Crescent Hill, the place he'd circled on the map with pencil and promise, he saw another car parked on the roadside. Hood up. Hazard lights blinking. An old man might have driven by. But Walter had spent the last few months tending to the broken, and he knew a call when he saw one. He slowed, pulled off the road, and parked a few yards behind. The car was a mid-2000s sedan, bent license plate, dust-caked windows, and a man standing beside it, waving slowly. Walter stepped out. You all right? He called. The man turned, and Walter stopped cold. It was David. He looked tired. Not the tired of physical labor or sleepless nights, but the kind of fatigue that rides under the surface, unresolved, heavy, like a story half-told. Didn't expect to see you, Walter said, walking slowly toward him. Didn't expect to break down either, David replied, managing a small smile. Alternators shot. I was heading north, trying to clear my head. Walter nodded. There's a repair shop about 15 miles back. Yeah, but no tow. and no signal. Walter looked at the car, then back at the Bel Air, then at the road ahead, still open, still waiting. "Where you headed?" he asked. David hesitated. "I don't know anymore." Walter considered that, then said quietly, "Get in." David blinked. "What?" "I'm not asking you to stay. Just ride with me a while. There's still some road left." They loaded David's bag in the trunk, and he climbed into the passenger seat slowly, cautiously, like someone entering a church not quite sure if they were welcome. For the first few miles, neither spoke. But the silence wasn't sharp. It was tentative, respectful, like a conversation being tuned before the first note. Then, as they passed a sign that read Crescent Hill 2 miles, David asked, "Why here?" Walter smiled faintly. "She and I always wanted to see the stars from the ridge. Never made it. Life got in the way." David looked out the window. "She told me about you. Not a lot, but enough." "I didn't know she had a son," Walter said softly. "She wasn't supposed to," David replied. "Doctors told her she couldn't. I was a surprise. A hard one, I think." Walter's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "She was always kind," David continued, "but distant. Like her heart was in a different year." Walter didn't respond. They reached the ridge just as the sun began to settle low against the western sky, turning the trees into silhouettes and the air gold. Walter pulled over. They got out in silence, climbed a short hill, and stood looking out over the valley. "I used to wonder who she was before me," David said. "And now?" Walter asked. David looked down at the car. "Now I think I know." Walter reached into his pocket and handed him the folded letter. David hesitated. "I thought that was for you." "It was," Walter said. "But maybe now it's for us." They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the last light fade. The stars began to appear, shyly at first, then all at once. And under that wide, velvet sky, with the Bel Air cooling behind them and the past humming quietly in the air, 2 men, linked not by blood, but by love, stood without speaking. Because sometimes, the road isn't about getting somewhere. It's about remembering who we're driving for. The morning after Crescent Hill broke like a photograph from an old family album. Soft light washing over tall grass. The sky pale blue with faint golden brushstrokes near the horizon. Walter and David stood quietly beside the car, steam curling from coffee mugs held without urgency. There wasn't much that needed saying. The Bel Air sat still and content in the gravel turnout, its engine cool, its body gleaming faintly beneath a light coat of dust. It looked like it belonged there, like it had always been waiting for just this road, just this moment. Walter sipped slowly and looked out across the hills. "You think she knew?" he asked finally. David didn't answer at first. Then, "I think she hoped." Walter nodded. They loaded the car in silence and got back on the road. There were still miles left. Not many, but just enough. As the coast came closer, the air began to change. The trees gave way to long, sweeping plains. The scent of salt began to thread through the wind. And at last, just after noon, the road rose slightly, turned, and opened into a wide view of the Pacific Ocean, vast and steady, like time itself had taken a deep breath. Walter pulled the car into a small overlook, one Ellie had circled decades ago in an old guidebook, now yellowed and folded at the seams. The ocean shimmered in front of them, endless and impossibly calm. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, then reached into the glove box and pulled out the cassette. Summer 63, Ellie. He placed it into the player and turned the volume just enough to hear her voice over the wind and the surf. "If you're hearing this, it means we made it. Maybe not the way we planned, but we got there. And that's something." David turned toward the window, eyes lowered. Walter just closed his eyes. "I don't believe in ghosts," Ellie's voice continued. "But I believe that certain things stay, if we love them hard enough." The music returned, slow, dreamy, that same Roy Orbison track they'd danced to barefoot in a field long gone. Walter opened the door, stepped out into the sun, and walked to the edge of the cliff, where the ocean opened up before him like a memory too large to hold all at once. He reached into his pocket and took out the locket. For a moment, he simply stood there, rolling it in his hand, feeling the warmth it had absorbed from his skin. Then, slowly, he opened it. Inside, a tiny photograph, him and Ellie, taken with a borrowed Polaroid in the summer of 1963. They were young, laughing. His hand was on her waist. Her eyes were closed. He smiled, and then he let the locket drop gently into the ocean wind. It didn't fall like a stone. It danced, spinning once, catching the light, disappearing. When he returned to the car, David didn't speak. He didn't need to. They drove in silence for a while, back along the winding highway. A few hours later, they reached a small coastal diner. They parked the Bel Air beside a row of modern SUVs, its turquoise paint catching the last of the afternoon sun. Walter turned off the ignition, but didn't move. David watched him. And then Walter handed him the keys. David stared. "What are you doing?" Walter smiled, tired but peaceful. "Finishing what she started." David didn't move at first. Then he took the keys. Slowly, like they were a memory too precious to rush. Walter stepped out, stretched his legs, looked at the horizon one last time. "She wanted someone to drive it," he said. "Not store it. Not worship it. Drive it." David turned the keys over in his hand. "Where do I go?" Walter gave a small shrug. "Wherever the road still calls." And then he placed a hand on the roof of the car, just once, as if blessing it. They walked into the diner together. Two men who had loved the same woman in different ways, bound not by history alone, but by how they chose to carry it. Inside, the waitress greeted them with a smile and 2 menus. "You boys traveling?" she asked. Walter looked at David. David looked out at the Bel Air. And then, softly, "Yeah, I think we are."